she's been, providing her insight and expertise for, quite a while to the Denver Agile community, and I think, the national community as well. She's given plenty of presentations. She's also been on our list for the Agile Denver yearly conference, the Mile High Agile Conference, and was slated to speak for us this year. Unfortunately, it got canceled. So we get to have a little bit of a, kind of like rehearsal performance or after the curtain falls performance. So really happy to have her here to do that. Talking about evolutionary patterns of portfolio Kanban. So we're always looking for ways that we can make Agile more sustainable in our organizations. And I think that I know as a Scrum Master, sometimes I feel like I'm getting pretty good at identifying patterns or issues at the team level. I have not really thought of that at the portfolio level. I like to think that's somebody else's job. I gotta figure that out. So I'm glad that she's here to talk about that. Let's dig into some of that and get out of some of the siloed, mindsets that we have. All right, so we're gonna have Colleen speak, but before we do, I do have a silly question for her also, so that we can just kind of learn something. And Colleen, my question for you is, the zombie apocalypse is coming. Who do you want on your team?
How big does this team get to be? Do I have a size restriction?
I think if you answer the why you want the people on your team, we'll figure that scope out pretty quick.
Okay. I'm going to say, first and foremost, I'd have to have my husband there because he's one of the only people that can keep me calm when I start freaking out. So he would have to be there just to calm me down, bring me down a level. And then I'll go probably a little more generic and say probably a scientist or a doctor, a civil engineer, and a cook, and no politicians. So we'll say that we'll have the scientist there to help us solve the apocalypse, and the doctor there to help heal people, the civil engineer to help us rebuild our cities without politics involved, and the chef to help feed everybody and bring everybody back to health. So that would be my pick. I feel like my post-apocalyptic world sounds a little like a commune, but that's probably not too far off. Yeah,
very good. All right. Well, thank you for indulging me there for that. And I think we'll go ahead and jump right in. So again, folks, please, if you're having questions as we go along, let's drop them into the chat, and we will kind of screen those a little bit and see if we can interject or if we can hold those to the end. Again, thanks.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to be here. This is such a cool way to share across cities like this. We were talking before we opened up to everybody what an amazing community the Agile, the group of Agile practitioners is local here to Denver. But then when you connect with people in Austin or in other cities, we find that this network is kind of small and mighty. And it's really cool to feel like you have these connections to all these other cities, especially with everything going on in the world around us right now. So thank you all for joining. So we're going to talk about portfolio Kanban. I'm going to start with just what is portfolio Kanban, and then we'll talk about some of the common things that I tend to see in kicking this off and kind of how we see it go from maybe it's more infant stages where we're met with a lot of resistance to once we start to see it really take off, what that looks like and some of the common patterns in acceptance. As Lori said, my name is Colleen Johnson. You covered Scatter Spoke so well. Thank you for that plug. And I'm a Lean Kanban and accredited coaching professional and trainer, and have been active with Agile Denver for many years. I'm currently a member of the Agile Uprising Board of Directors, and we have a fun podcast if no one has to commute anymore, so I don't know how many people sit at home and listen to podcasts, but if you get a chance, check it out. We've got some really interesting content on there lately. And my most important job is mama to these three. So in my free time, I mostly am currently just constantly cleaning our kitchen and trying to catch up on sleep. So these guys keep me on my toes. So we'll go through a little bit here. Let's just start with Kanban. What are we talking about with Kanban, and what does this look like when we apply it to the portfolio level? I think for so many of us, especially Jira users, when we talk Kanban, we think board, right? It's just a board, especially in Jira. So what's important about Kanban here is that it actually has two meanings, and both of those are incorporated into the Kanban method. So when we think about this, one piece of this is sign or large visual board, and that's what we think of when we see all of our work displayed in one place. But the other piece that's equally as important and needs to be true to have your Kanban system working is this concept of a signal card. And when we say signal card, what we mean by that is a signal of capacity. So there's a couple ways I like to think about visualizing this in our everyday life. More and more when you go to a shopping mall and when those reopen, or to the airport, you'll see these light strips on the parking garages that have a green light, or will tell you the number of open parking spots in any row. So you don't have to swerve up and down all the rows looking for a parking spot. And that light's a signal, right, that there's capacity in that lane for your vehicle. So think of that when we think of how we can combine that signal that we have space to take on more work with the visualization or the large board. Both of those need to be true. There are 4 main principles of Kanban. The first is start with what you do now. So we try not to make any changes to the process. We're just introducing a way to visualize that and show capacity without changing the way that we're working or the order in which we're doing things. The second is to agree to pursue evolutionary change, which just means that our Kanban system is never really done. We don't put it in place and then we're like, we do Kanban. Thank you, box checked. When we say this, we mean that we're constantly coming back and looking at this process to say, what could we change? What could we do to make it better? I always tell teams, if your Kanban board looks the same in 6 months, then we're doing something wrong, right? Because we haven't gone back to say what's changed, how's our team changed, how's the work that comes in or leaves our team changing the way our process looks. 3 is respect roles, responsibilities, and job titles where you start. So there's no changes there until you see a need for them. So this is really kind of evidence-driven change to your process and to your team. And the last is encourage acts of leadership at all levels. I think this can always seem a little ambiguous by what do we mean by that? And really what we're getting to with encourage acts of leadership at all levels is that we want to create a system that doesn't need necessarily a manager to come in and say, this is the next item that you need to pick up, or why is this item behind? We want to create a system that puts the structure in place for the team to manage their work and be able to look at it and say, this ticket needs help, or this ticket is aging and I need to go help somebody move it across the finish line, or there's a blocker that's creating some urgency that we need to address as a team. So we want to create all of these visual indicators so that the team knows how to arrange themselves around that work without having a manager do it for them. So Kanban has all these great sayings. You'll see these kind of peppered throughout here. We need like a Kanban sticker pack for this presentation. The most well-known here is stop starting and start finishing. So we're always going to be looking to what can we get over the finish line or what's closest to being done rather than pulling in new work. And that sounds easy. And the saying makes it sound so cute, but it's really hard to do. We're all always looking to what's in the to-do column, what's the next item, what's the next highest priority thing I can start work on. And we want to shift our thinking in a Kanban system to what is the closest to getting finished and creating that space for work to move downstream. There's 6 core Kanban practices. The first is pretty simple. It's visualizing our work and making everything that we're working on visible in one place. So if you have your work spread across multiple different boards, or if you have to look at multiple different backlogs to figure out what the highest priority is, part of what we're starting to do with our visualization here is get all of that work visible in one place so we can make smarter decisions about where to put our energy and put our capacity. The second is limiting our work in progress or work in process. And that's simply just acknowledging that, you know, there's only so much work we as individuals and teams and organizations can produce. No matter how much coffee we put in our system, we have a finite capacity, right? And so work in progress limits really help us understand what is that capacity and how do we manage the amount of work coming in so that we're balancing it against that capacity and creating kind of a sustainable pace for the work that moves through our teams. The third is managing flow. And what's interesting about managing flow when we start thinking about it is when I work with a lot of new Kanban teams, one of the things I hear frequently is that this feels kind of big brother-ish, or it feels like we're managing individual performance or trying to make developers code faster. But when we talk about managing flow, what we're really looking for in those efficiencies is how do we make this process better? So if I know it takes me on average 10 days to complete a user story, and I find out that only 5 of those days are actually hands-on keyboard time, working on the code and testing it to get it out the door. My focus isn't how do I get this team to get this story done in 4 days. My focus is on the other 5 days where work is sitting and not being, not hands-on keyboard time, because we have work sitting in our system or being blocked or not being addressed. So when we think about flow, we want to focus on those as inefficiencies in our system. We do that with policies. So we make our workflow policies explicit at every stage of the process. And think of policies as just really exit criteria for each stage of your board. So for something to move from dev to QA, we might say that it has to go through code review or a certain round of unit testing. And once those policies are considered done, then it's ready to move to the QA stage. The fifth here is implement feedback loops. And feedback loops happen in a Kanban system on many different levels. So this can be feedback loops about your process. So looking at data and evaluating team metrics to help figure out what changes to make to the process itself. Feedback loops can happen at the portfolio level, and we'll look at some of those here in a moment. And then they can also happen with your customers, right? So we want to start creating a feedback loop where we're getting feedback from what we're deploying and using that data to help us make decisions about what to prioritize next. And the last is improve collaboratively and evolve experimentally. And what we mean by this is kind of what I said at the beginning. We just want to make sure that this process is never implemented and done. We're constantly coming back and saying, what things could we try to make the way we work better, right? And think about those flow efficiencies that we could be gaining in our process. I tend to be pretty liberal with what I let teams or portfolio groups do here. I've had teams who've said, we don't need WIP limits. And I always say, okay, let's try it. Tell me what you think will happen and we'll measure it and we'll come back and see if it's working for us. This really helps the team feel a sense of ownership over their processes and their practices when you give them that autonomy to try new things and see if it works for them. And what you'll end up with is very different variations of a lot of these core practices across the organization. So when we think about all of this, how does this relate to the portfolio? So all of the principles and practices that we just talked about for what we would kind of think of typically of team level Kanban can be applied at the program, portfolio, or organizational level. But when we think about the portfolio specifically, we're thinking about how do we visualize, manage, and measure all of our features or epics from idea to delivery. And I'll toggle back and forth here between the term feature and epic because I think it's kind of framework specific or almost tool specific if you're using Jira, what level you would have on your portfolio board. It'll vary from organization to organization. But really what we want to look at here is how do we pull new work into our system and see that so that we can prioritize it, pick what's the highest priority to pull next, and then track where we are through that delivery until it's in our customers' hands.
Hey, Colleen.
Yeah.
We had a question about WIP limits. Will you be covering that here shortly?
Not a ton of detail. If somebody wants to expand on what they mean by WIP limits, I'd be happy to dive into it a little.
So Lee was asking in the portfolio, what do you like to recommend as a place to start for their initial WIP limits?
Yeah, so we're going to talk a little bit about system balancing, but one of the things that I see very frequently, and I'll show you some pictures around this, is that most teams start with portfolio WIP limits that are entirely built around engineering capacity. And so what you end up doing is you have overloaded your portfolio system by having too many things because maybe you have 12 engineering teams, right, for this portfolio. and they're, you know, you're like, there's an epic for each team, and you have 3 product owners, right? They cannot keep pace with keeping 12 teams fed. And you see that all the way to the left, right? The further we go upstream, we can't do discovery for that many teams with 2 people or 3, you know. So what we have to look at is we start to break down WIP limits across the whole system and looking at capacity for every stage of the portfolio process. And we'll look at some more that in a little bit more detail here shortly. Did that help, Lee?
That's great, thank you.
Cool, okay. So I talked here a little bit about Kanban at all levels. One of the things that I love the most about portfolio Kanban is that your teams don't need to be doing Kanban. So if you're working with teams, whether it's SAFe or Scrum and Scale, their portfolio Kanban works with whatever your teams are doing, and all of the practices and the patterns that we're going to walk through here can actually, I think, help to combine a lot of disparate team practices. So I'm working with an organization now where some of the teams are Scrum and some of the teams are Kanban, but we use the portfolio board to really connect all of those different team cadences in one place. So we have visibility into that progress across all of those different teams, and the fact that they have that autonomy to pick their the different ways that they want to work. So let's start with this view. So when I think of the portfolio board, I like to break this into 2 separate phases, or 2 separate sections of my portfolio Kanban. One being discovery and the other being delivery. And the core difference between those 2 is what we call a commitment line. So this dashed line that you see here is when we say, yes, we're committing our resources now to building this thing. When we think about everything to the left of that commitment line, that's what we call our options, right? So this is all the things we're vetting, and we're even trying to determine, is this an investment that we want to make as a business? So that we can then say, yes, we're going to prioritize this, and pull it across that commitment line and into our delivery Kanban. So I was looking through our names. I don't know if we have our lovely Shauna from Agile Denver on the call or not, but this board visual is courtesy of Athlinks here locally. They have an amazing portfolio system, and you can see here, they've got to the left of their product definition, opportunities and assessments. So here they even have the commitment line where things go from an idea card to an epic card. So what we're looking for here is, at what point is this just an option to being something that we're going to invest money in building? And what can be really nice about creating visibility into your opportunities or your ideas is you can also create a way for people who maybe in the organization don't feel like they get to contribute to that or offer up their ideas. They can see them, they can see where they are. I think one thing that's just as important as visualizing those opportunities and kind of where they are in the life cycle of being vetted is showing which ones get kicked out. So I worked with one portfolio board where we had a lane underneath the board where we would show this opportunity went through testing and went through evaluation, and we decided not to do it. But that helped from a lot of, we had a lot of sales team requests where they would say, we keep getting this request from customers. And we were able to say we vetted it and we explored this, but we've decided not to commit to it for whatever reason. And we were able to visualize that for the organization too. So everything on this left side of our board can be called either your discovery Kanban or upstream Kanban, but we're really looking at what is our process for validating these ideas. So think of this part. I like to think of this as kind of a 2-step approach, right? If you've read any of the lean startup writing, which it feels like old news at this point, right? But what we're thinking about for our upstream Kanban or discovery process is kind of 2 steps here. It's problem validation and solution validation. And the first part of that is, does this problem exist? And looking at, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How urgent is it? And this is, I think, one of the hardest things to do. Our backlogs from an engineering perspective tend to be full of solutions. It's hard sometimes to step back from those solutions and say, what problem are we trying to solve? And give your organization and your teams an opportunity to say, here's the problem. is there more than one solution to this problem? It's much easier said than done, but I love playing this game of trying to kicking all the epics back a level to say, what problem are we trying to solve, or kicking these features back up a level to say, what are we really trying to fix here? Because maybe there's more than one solution to explore. And that's the second part of your discovery Kanban, is your solution validation. So really looking at, now that we understand this problem really well and we know what problem we're trying to solve, what different solutions can we test so that we pick the best solution to the problem we're trying to solve. I wish I had a poll here like yours, Lori, to ask how many people have these steps, but I'm definitely curious if anybody has any comments they want to share in the chat, please do. I know this is something that I think organizations don't put a whole lot of money into. It feels like an afterthought sometimes, or I see where the role gets kind of split across product manager, product owner, and this upstream discovery part becomes kind of a handoff after it's done. So I mentioned we want to experiment with the solutions, come up with more than one solution, and then test those with our users. And then once we get past this point, we move from our commitment line and saying this work has gone through whatever phases we need for our discovery Kanban, and it's going to move into our delivery Kanban. So one of the things you see in your delivery Kanban is now the stages that work goes through to be developed and shipped to customers. And this will look different for different organizations. Like we said at the beginning with one of our Kanban principles is we don't want to copy another board or steal from another board. We want this to map the activities that take place for our unique organization. I worked with another group here in Denver and we built their portfolio Kanban. We had a really hard time naming these stages because of the activities that were taking place in each stage. And so we went back and named them the different stages that beer goes through to be fermented. So they had nothing to do with any roles or departments in the organization. It was really just like the process that things went through to be ready for consumption, if you will. So what we want to do to figure out what our stages look like on the portfolio board is identify what activities are needed. And whether you're looking at an epic level or a feature level, we want to think about the activities rather than roles or departments. And I start with the activities, mapping these activities before I think about the stages. So I'll get everybody in the room who's part of this process, and this is not a cheap meeting, but we're talking about product strategy, sales, customer support, marketing. You want as many voices in there as you can to say, what is happening for your group while we're developing, or what is happening for your group while we're getting ready to deploy something. If you're in an organization that has a comms team, this is super important for their involvement, for marketing, right? To be able to say, we're preparing launch materials. And what you're really looking for as you map out all these activities are, how can we move more of the activities to the left? So we're starting things sooner. And so we don't have those big waiting periods in our process. So marketing is a great example. And there's often some friction between marketing and engineering because we give them dates and they're waiting to do a big activity when we're ready to deploy something, and then we miss that date. Maybe we miss that date. So one of the things that can be super helpful about this is being able to see across the process if marketing can start some of those activities earlier so they're not waiting for a big handoff when we're dev complete. Are there things that they can be doing so that everybody's kind of turning things on or flipping the switch at the same time? This is an example of kind of how I go through that process. So I would not have the pink stickies up here at the beginning, but you can see I have different groups posting the activities they're going through. So, you know, we're going through epic definition and user testing and wireframe designs. We have things up here like training, how are we going to roll out training internally? And we're marking which person owns making sure that this activity takes place. And then we're mapping these to what can happen at the same time, but what are all the things that have to be true for something to move from one stage to the next? So if we look at that define column in the middle, you can see that those are the things that we've identified that need to be true for a feature or an epic to move from define to design. We don't want to start these design activities until we know that all those define activities are complete. So what you did here was you actually created your workflow policies by mapping these activities. And I'll pause here and see if anyone has questions on this.
So Colleen, Jessica has a question. Are you using prescribed scaled Agile events? And if you are, which ones?
I'm not using any prescribed scaled Agile events for this process. So one of the things, I think you can use this with scaled Agile, absolutely, and you would have more of a cadence-based planning around this, like PI planning. And obviously one of the things you'll see if you're using portfolio Kanban for Scrum teams is things are going to move based on your release cadence, right? So your epics may move at the for each release train, and you'll see things kind of chunk across the board together, where if you have more team level Kanban, you're going to see more variation to when things pull. Both work. So it's definitely not a requirement to be running any kind of scaled Agile to make use of this. So the next thing here around those policies that we created is we want to track if we've done them or not, right? So one of the things, and we'll talk here about our patterns in a moment. Once you create these policies, and I tried to zoom in on this photo a little, but what you can see in this box at the right hand of your screen is those policies are listed out under each stage. And then for our tickets on this board, or our cards, we have the letters or the corresponding letters of the alphabet for each exit policy at the bottom of our feature cards. So we can check off when they're done and as they move. This helps with a couple things. It makes sure that we don't have the same conversation at every stand-up, so that we're just talking about what work is remaining and how close is this feature to being ready to be pulled for the next column. And it also gives us some accountability. And we'll come back to this in a moment. So one of the things we're trying to do with this process is fold learning in at every phase of this and use data to make decisions. And so one of the things you'll see on your portfolio board is we start to see data around the activities that are complete for each stage, as well as kind of an overall % complete moving across the entire board. And that helps us make a lot of decisions around when to start new activities. When we think about a Kanban system, we're trying to create pull so that we don't create piles of work in our system. So what we don't want to do is be working so fast to define new work that we end up with 20 defined features for 5 teams that can't pull those fast enough. This helps us focus our efforts on just-in-time definition, because we can see that as we're completing these workflow policies and epics are getting close to being completed or moving downstream, then we know that we're close to being ready to pull the next item. So it helps us balance when to start new activities or new phases based on when things are closer to completing. It also helps us make our success metrics and our expectations really clear. So I think for a lot of teams, when we kick this process off and we start working on defining our policies, there's a lot of assumptions made about who's doing what and when, and this makes it really clear and provides that level of accountability throughout the whole process.
Hey, Colleen, JB also has a question. What type of cadence do you use for those sessions?
I'm guessing that's stand-ups probably, or for the session to get the acceptance criteria or the workflow policies?
Yes, to get the workflow policies.
I usually kick it off with that, and then I give this, I usually try to do monthly portfolio retrospectives where we're reviewing data and going back at the policies, and we'll look at this in a minute here, but most organizations tend to create an incredible amount of policies because it's like an opportunity to police other teams. It's like all the things that everybody says that they should be doing but aren't. It's like an opportunity to have a public checklist for each other. And it's not sustainable. It's not particularly useful either. But what we see is as we meet with those groups, if we keep coming back to that list every month, and now we have a bunch of data to tell us, maybe you said that we have to create a release plan for every single feature. But we've noticed that the last 10 features we've deployed, we didn't do that for that. We skipped that step every time, and it seems like we're still releasing okay and with no issues. Maybe that doesn't need to be an exit policy anymore. So I like to keep coming back to them on a regular basis. But once you see that you're whittling that list down and what's there is pretty condensed and valuable, I think you can do it less frequently. But workflow policies, whether you're talking team level or portfolio level, they're always subject to change. You want to invite that change based on what the team is seeing and what we need to serve the team or the portfolio.
Thank you.
Yeah. One of the other things we're trying to do with this system is measure outcomes and fold that feedback into decision making. And so I'm not sure if you can see it on this board. I'm going to backtrack here a little. I don't think you have the full view here, but to the right of this launch column is a column that says learn. And I think that's such an important part of your portfolio board. And so what we do with that learn column is we say, what were the success metrics we set for this feature? And we define that up front. And then we track that and we talk about it as part of our portfolio level stand-ups. So we'll say, for this feature, we expected to see a 20% uptick in new signups in the first month. And so we want those to be time bound. But then we use that data, we'll track that data on the portfolio Kanban and say, maybe if by the end of a month, we only saw a 10% increase in new signups. So we might change what we're gonna prioritize next based on this data that we're collecting, right? Maybe we need to focus more features on new customer acquisition. So we wanna make that data visible so that we can use that data to help prioritize what's next. So let's talk about how this translates to real life. Oh, go ahead, Kristen.
Sorry, one more question. I think it was actually pertinent for that last slide. It's Agile Coaching is the screen name, but they asked, how do you measure value?
So this, it's super hard, right? I think one of the things that's really important is I always try to work with the product owners or product managers to define this upfront and to keep it small and time bound and just pick one thing, right? I think we all have a tendency to get this laundry list of things to try to measure, and it becomes unwieldy and hard to, not only hard to gather the data, but hard to interpret the data. From a what to measure perspective, I think it depends on the growth of what you're working on, right? New systems are going to have different metrics than old systems. And it's going to vary from acquisition to quality to uptime, right? But what you're trying to think about is if we go all the way back to the beginning of our portfolio system and say, what problem are we trying to solve? How will you measure that you solve that problem for your user, for your customer? And what's one small thing, how do you time box it? And then tie that back to the original problem that you outlined. And I really like to get this documented before we get into development so that you can bring this to the teams. It's great. It's a great conversation for dev teams to be thinking about the problem that they're solving and how we're going to measure that success. All right, well, let's get into the reality of this because this all sounds great on paper, right? What happens when we actually put this into practice? So I want to talk about 3 patterns of resistance around hidden work, over governance, and status hell. And then how do we transition this into something that's working well for us, where we really are focusing on just-in-time definition, this system balance of looking at a workload across an entire engineering organization or entire portfolio, rather than just team by team, and how do we get to really transparent prioritization of work. So let's talk about resistance first. I think anytime that you are creating a lot of visibility, there's going to be some resistance. There's I think some fear. I mentioned, I think sometimes it can come with feeling like, is this going to be used to track my individual contribution or my individual performance as a contributor to a team? Or is our team going to be reprimanded because we're not delivering as fast as another team? So I think one of the first things we start to see is hidden work. So this is all the work that we talk about, but never shows up on the board. So from a Kanban perspective, we typically shift our stand-up conversation to walk the board from right to left. So rather than going round robin for status, we're just going to talk about the work items and work our way across the board. But what's tricky about that is you're probably going to hear people say, when we say, how is this particular feature going? Well, this team got pulled off to work on this urgent thing that the executives asked them to pick up. And it's not on the board yet because they just have to get it done quickly. So all this work is hidden. It's hard to track. It's hard to measure the impact. And that's one of the things that we're trying to kind of shine a light on with our portfolio Kanban system. So we'll call this Don't Show, Don't Tell. What we want to focus on here is how do we pull that stuff forward, right? What you'll see, what this looks like initially is that the portfolio board is only going to talk about what people, high level things, right? Especially if it's a physical board. The pattern, kind of the negative pattern here is we only end up putting the work on there that we want to see and that we want to talk about. But all those one-off requests or all those things that derail the team never make it onto the board. So I want to watch for things like I mentioned, we got blocked by this other thing, and that's why our status hasn't changed or our progress hasn't changed on this feature, or this team got pulled off to do some production support issues. The one that we always hear is, someone asked me to do this real quick, or will just take me 5 minutes to divert the team to go help with this other thing. Those are all the things where we have hidden work that has a real impact to what is actually on the board and often isn't tracked. The second thing is overgovernance. And so I mentioned this a little bit with policies. So when we think about overgovernance, I worked with one group where our portfolio board, I mentioned I use letters to say, here's the workflow policies, and here's how we'll track that we've done those workflow policies. The alphabet we went through the alphabet twice in its entirety at the bottom of every feature card. That's a lot of exit policies for one feature to go through. Over time, we got it down to 8, but that took almost 1.5 years. So someone asked the question of how often do you revisit those? It took us a lot of whittling those down. But what started, and what I see most frequently when we have that conversation around activities, is we try to create a lot of accountability over the things that we feel like other people aren't doing. So we end up with all this over-governance on our board, where we're trying to create this massive checklist to say, here's all the stuff that I feel like marketing never has ready, or marketing may say, here's all the stuff we never get out of engineering in time that we need to have in this list. And some of the things we're trying to look for here are how do we break down this kind of overabundance, right, of exit policies for every single thing that could happen. I let the team start there because I think it's important to see what we're not doing. And a lot of teams end up creating this massive list of exit policies and then, or portfolio policies that never get checked off. And so I'll keep those cards for those retros or those portfolio reviews where we go back through then and say, it looks like we created 5 or 6 policies here that we've done one time for 30 features. So let's go back and talk about, is that really providing us value? I think I cannot think of a single portfolio process I've been a part of putting in place where this hasn't happened. But I think it's kind of the natural progression. Everybody wants to show all of these things at first, and then we whittle them down based on reality and what's actually serving its purpose. And the last one here is status hell. So I'm sure everyone can relate to this, but we run through the same irrelevant updates about every epic or every feature at every single stand-up. Nothing's changing, right? So what ends up happening here is all we're doing is basically talking about the same stuff every time, and we don't have enough information on these cards to be able to really understand what's going on. Sometimes, I'll be honest, this is a limitation of the tools that you're working in. You know, Jira only allows a certain number of things to display on a card at a time. I'm a big fan of analog boards at the portfolio level. And I'll talk about that in a minute about why I think that's so valuable, but it's obviously hard right now. We're all working from home. So one of the things we want to think about here is when you hear people or teams giving the same updates at the portfolio stand-ups, we really want to dig into what's missing from the conversation. And those become cues for us about what information we need to pull forward on the cards. And this changes, right? In the same way that your process changes, we want to think about this from the perspective of how do we keep adding new information so that we can see all those visual indicators we talked about and understand what are our cues, where's our capacity, our space to pull in new work. So things like percent complete is an important one, and I'll use that from a dev perspective frequently to say this feature is 25% complete versus this feature that's 80% complete, because that's giving me an indication of where I'm going to have capacity next. And you can back that all the way through your upstream stages, right? From a design perspective, using those exit policies to say how much work is remaining to get this ready for the next stage.
And Colleen, we had one more question about whether or not we control the size of the initiative.
Yeah, so from a Kanban perspective, size actually doesn't matter in this case, but I will say that varies a little bit if you are using a release train process. I know you may have restrictions around how much work you can get done in to get your feature into the next release train. So it's time boxed. That can still work with a portfolio Kanban system, and without getting too much into like metrics or forecasting around how you would figure out how much work that is, I would say that that could be one way where you may need to size them to be able to meet your release train cadence or your PI planning cadence. But from a traditional Kanban perspective, the size of the work items doesn't matter. What does matter is we want them to be as small as possible and still deliver value. So your goal is always that you're focusing on the smallest units of work, whether it's story, epic, feature, that can move quickly and deliver value. And those two are kind of critical together, because if we make them so small that they're not valuable anymore, we create dependencies on different work items now where we can't have this feature go without this feature, because we've made them too small, essentially. But we want them small because we want to see movement across this board frequently. And that's true, again, at team, portfolio, or enterprise level. We want to see that movement, and having movement and flow through your system gives you the opportunity to respond to change more easily. If we're working on things that take us 6 months to move through the board, we're really locked into that work item, and we don't have an opportunity to pivot or pull in something new or change direction. So keeping those items as small as possible gives us a lot of flexibility to reprioritize and shift gears if needed, which is really what we're trying to do with Agile, right? We want that easy, make it easy to respond to change. So let's cover the patterns we see when we move past that resistance and we start to see the rewards of our portfolio board. So we'll talk about just in time and some system balance, and then how do we start to see really transparent prioritization of work items. So when we talk about just in time, I mentioned the example where for a lot of organizations, there's just a need to fill everything, right? And so one of the things that often happens is we look at our backlog and we're trying to work as quickly as possible to define as much work as we can and have that backlog full. And what often happens is as that backlog gets more defined and more filled up, it gets outdated. It gets lower and lower in priority. We tend to prioritize new things above those things we defined 6 months ago. And I think one of the most critical things to think about here is we're constantly learning new information when we write code, when we work with our customers, when we have these quick feedback loops. If we're trying to define all of this work 6 months, of what we're going to be working on 6 months, we're locking 6 months from now, we're locking ourselves into decisions that might not be the smartest decision. So COVID's probably a great example of that for a lot of us. If we had known at the end of last year that this would be what our lives were like, we probably wouldn't have maybe prioritized some of the things that we were back then, right? Spring break trips, summer vacations. So what we want to do is give ourselves a lot of opportunity to take new information in and respond to that when we need to. And we do that by this concept of just in time, which means we want to make sure that we have just enough information. So when we start to see, and I'll use development as an example again, if I can see that this team is, let's say 75% complete with the feature that they're on, I know that we need to start looking at what feature is going to be next for that team to start doing maybe story grooming on. So we're always looking at these different indicators of where things are to understand what's next to pull. And same thing with that discovery process, right? I don't want to be working through discovery so quickly that I've identified the next 10 features that are going to take us into 2024, because what if there's another major change in how we all work or what we're all delivering? And that's basically wasted effort, right? I've put all this energy into defining all of these features that aren't relevant for us to build anymore. So think about this. There's another Kanban saying to defer commitment until the last responsible moment. So when you think of this concept of deferring commitment, and you'll I'm sure I'm going to make a few people mad with this. Think of when you leave your airport and you have all those stalls to pay at when you're coming out of the parking structure. I'm the car that's pulled back at the very, very back of all of them, waiting for one of them to open up, because I don't want to pull up behind the car or get in the line where somebody's credit card gets stuck or they can't get the receipt to print because I've committed and now I can't get out of that line. So think about that concept when you think about your Kanban system, right? From a portfolio level, if I'm filling up the queue with things and I'm making all these decisions on what I know today, I'm not giving myself the opportunity to pivot or change my mind when new information comes in. So we want to focus on keeping everything small through managing our work in progress limits so that we have that opportunity to change direction and to pivot on what's the highest priority.
And Colleen, we have a couple of questions in the queue. Did you want to finish anything before we answer those?
A few more, because I know we're almost to 6:30, and then is that the time box, 6:30?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay, so I'll keep going through these and then we'll bounce back.
All right, thanks.
Answer a couple in the process. So when we're looking at what's next to pull, we want to use that information to help us make that decision, but we also want to keep these queues small so that we have that opportunity to reprioritize. So the next thing that we want to look at here is system balance. So when we think about system balance, what we want to think about here is that we don't want the capacity of engineering or any other part of our overall portfolio system to dictate the amount of work in other parts of the system. And I used engineering here as the example because it's one of the things I see most often. And what this ends up looking like for a lot of organizations is we have, like I said, 12 engineering teams. So we can have 12 epics in progress at any given time. But then what we see is we have 2 or 3 product owners or 2 or 3 product managers doing all that discovery work, and they can't keep pace with keeping this queue filled for 12 teams. And over time, what you start to see is we see that system unbalance becomes very visual through your portfolio board, where it's hard to see that when you don't see anything upstream tracked in that way, because we're only looking at like that delivery queue and we're not thinking about all of those activities that take place to get that work ready. So one of the things we want to think about here is how do we look at the system capacity and how do we start to balance that out? And you see that pretty quickly when you see that maybe these upstream columns or these upstream stages can't stay full, or we start to see maybe we need to combine or shorten our development cycle WIP limit to be more in line so we're not burning everybody out upstream trying to keep pace. So maybe it means 2 teams or 3 teams work on one feature and that feature can move faster. And we can also distribute some of this workload and balance it out upstream. I think you see the same thing downstream too. It's not, this is a common imbalance that I see, but I think you can see the same thing with, marketing. You see it at a team level with QA. But having your portfolio system visualize this really helps address it and shift the thinking from how do we optimize for just one part to how do we optimize for delivery across all of these stages. So WIP limits at the portfolio level really help us create that flow. They help us minimize multitasking and context switching for the teams. They help us reduce overburdening in certain pockets of the business or certain departments, right, that are contributing to that overall portfolio flow. And they really expose those capacity issues and bottlenecks so that we can address them organizationally. All right, the last one here, and then we can go into some questions, is transparent priority. So I think this is the most important thing you can get from your portfolio system. If you get nothing else, this is what you should do it for. And that is that one of the things that I think we have probably all felt at some point in our career is this feeling that people are making decisions and it's moving things around without understanding what the impact of that decision is. And this happens a lot if you've heard of like HIPPO prioritization, the highest paid person's opinion, or somebody, the Siegel prioritization, somebody comes in and swoops and poops all over what the team is doing. There's lots of different names for this concept, but basically what we're thinking here is somebody's changing the priority and they don't understand what we're stopping or what we're giving up by switching our focus. And the portfolio Kanban system really helps uncover that, so you can have a really clear conversation of if we pick this up, then this is what stops, and here's how far we are. Maybe we're 80% of the way through this feature being to production, and we can stop work to do that, or based on our cycle time or based on what we know about how long these features take us to develop, we could spend one more week on this, have it done, and then pick up the new thing you're asking us to do. It's hard to have that conversation if we can't see those trade-offs. So the portfolio board really helps provide a lot of informed decision-making. We can see what our options are. This also comes into play when we're thinking about what's the next highest priority. So if I know that we've gone through the process of defining these 3 features, but something new comes in and I want to make this highest priority, I can see what I'm pushing down in the queue. This also helps with cross-team dependencies. So there's a lot of different ways to visualize this, but it helps us understand if I stop work on this thing, am I blocking work for another team? There's lots of different ways to visualize those dependencies as well. But the board really helps make sure that we're having that conversation if we're shifting our focus. So our goal with all of this too is just making the impact of these decisions really clear so that we can say, if we're switching our focus from this to this, here's what's going to happen for the work that's in flight. If we're going to prioritize this orange card higher than the gray card, then this is what it means for what's next to pull. So we want to be able to have this conversation with all of this information in front of us. So I'll close out with this thought, and then we'll jump back to the questions that you said, Kristen. When I was growing up, we had a family friend who used to tell us that kids were born with magnets in their feet that matched up with magnets that were in the carpet in front of all TVs. And that's why kids would stand in front of the TV like this. And you'd always be like, get out of the way. One of the things I think that always feels like a success in an implementation of a portfolio Kanban system to me is the organic conversations that you start to see where people are standing in front of the board and saying, where is this? What is next? Is this a thing that I'm interested in or passionate about somewhere in the queue to pull next? You want your portfolio Kanban to be the TV with the magnets in the front for everyone in your organization so that you're starting to have these really important conversations and transparent decision-making taking place in the public and out in the open so everyone can see. So I'll close with that and let's jump back to questions.
So I'll start with Sherry's. This was about 10 minutes ago, but it was when you were talking about the states or stages in the board. And she wanted to ask if you mentioned whether you do or you don't put the derailers and diversions in the board.
So typically, and I'm guessing that means like blockers probably, or work that's a diversion. Well, I'll answer both. It's super important in all levels of Kanban to highlight the blockers. So if something is stuck, if we can't work on something, we want to block it in the state it's in and have it consume one of our WIP spaces for that, for whatever stage it's in. But you want to think of, a lot of this thinking comes from lean manufacturing, and in manufacturing, there's an and-on cord where if you see a defect go by, you stop the line because we don't want to keep moving around that defect and either make more of them or miss an opportunity to fix something that maybe is malfunctioning. So think of your blockers in your Kanban system that same way. You want to stop the line and create that blocker in the flow so that you have to address that issue rather than work around it.
And she's clarifying that she's meaning the hidden work.
Yeah, so you do want all the hidden work to show up, although I will say this isn't at a portfolio level especially, like you're not going to be putting defects up here or production issues or things like that. You may say a team is blocked because they've been pulled off on something like that, but I typically keep all of this to the same type, the same work item type. So it's all features or it's all epics. One of the things that is nice about tracking work this way, though, is you'll start to gather cycle time data for your epics or your features. And as you gather that cycle time data on how long those work items take for your portfolio, you'll get all of that work accounted for in that cycle time information. So things like getting pulled off for production support or for unplanned things that aren't accounted for or planned as part of that feature epic get reflected in the time it takes for those work items to move across the board.
And the next question is coming from our anonymous person called Phone. And they were asking, is it good to have all the stories defined in advance for a PI when the PI starts? The PI has like 5 iterations and there is an iteration.
Yeah, so I tend to say no. I think that this is going to be a big, it depends. I try to have enough stories defined for at least a sprint or 2, and then I try to make that iterative, right? So again, I think if you try to define too far ahead, you end up rewriting a lot of your stories once you start development. And I think you see that a lot at the beginning of a feature or an epic because the team doesn't know what they don't know, right? And so you're defining all these stories way in advance of getting in there and actually working. And then once the team does, you end up going back and you either see a lot of spin on the stories that were already written, or you see a lot of emergent work in the sense that, and I'm sure you guys can relate to this, the stories like the team's like, we need a new story for this, we need a new story for that, and your story count maybe goes from 40 to 60 because there's all these stories that suddenly get added once they get in there and start working. So I tend to approach the story writing in the same way, where it's more just in time. But I think it's also going to depend a little on the size of your epic or your feature. So the smaller those are, right, the easier it is to contain that scope. If you have 60 stories in your feature, it's going to be a lot, like you're locking yourself into trying to understand a much bigger set of functionality earlier on. If you can make these smaller and hopefully not a full PI per each one, then you can move faster and fold that new learning in a little quicker.
And we have 2, maybe 3 more. One comes from Fernando. He said it's a cool validation that he created a portfolio Kanban view within his Jira project. So he was happy to see that your states and his actually aligned pretty well. And then Mike Barker asked, what resources would you recommend to learn more about Kanban?
I think that the tool, it's a vendor, so take that with a grain of salt. Kanbanize is a Kanban specific tool, but I think they have done one of the best jobs out there of assembling a lot of information and videos, and I would say it's all really well done. So they have a great knowledge base on their site. And then the other place I would point people to is the Kanban guides that are fairly new and just came out, but very similar to the way the Scrum guides are written. The Kanban guides are put out, and I can provide that link. I don't know if it gets maybe in the Meetup notes or something later, but there's a link to those Kanban guides online, and they're community sourced and a great place to start.
Awesome. And Catherine Cartwright was asking, how do you determine if something belongs in discovery versus defines when it comes to identifying if we're solving the right problem?
I would lean on the exit policies for that, so understanding where you are with your exit policies, and that'll be different for everyone, right? Discovery may be something internal that could even include things like budgeting, matching up skills. Do we need to acquire, different developers to be able to do this work? So it's going to depend on what your exit policies are to decide where it goes. But the other piece of that then is that concept of the commit line. So you'll want to know, are we committing to work when we pull it into the discover column, or are we committing to work when we pull it into the definition column? I wouldn't get as hung up, I guess, on the labels for the stages as I would around what are the activities that are taking place in each one of those.
All right, and our last one is also from Phone again. Is there any study available that mentions Kanban versus Scrum at the team level, like advantages of one or the other?
There's definitely some white papers on the Kanban site. I know they've got some good material out there and some white papers and studies they've done for implementation at team and portfolio level. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be a comparison of Scrum versus Kanban. I mean, I think there's a lot of strengths to both approaches. And one of the things that I always think is the most important is that you have team buy-in. Both work great to deliver great software, but nothing works if the team's not engaged and not going to participate in these practices. So I let the teams really pick what's important to them. And if I have a team that's really interested in doing Kanban, I want them to understand the trade-offs to how they work. And again, be able to tell me how they think those trade-offs will benefit them before I let them switch.
And it's funny because people are actually answering Anne's question because she's asking whether Kanban works for non-IT projects. And I think many of us are furiously nodding our heads, yes.
Yeah, it does. I've had some amazing opportunities to apply this, and it is kind of one of my favorite places to play with Kanban. I worked with an HR team to build a Kanban process for their recruiting flow, which was cool because they had a really high referral bounty for their employees. So people wanted to know, if I refer Kristen, where is she in the process? Because I want to know if I'm going to get my referral bonus out of this.
Right.
So that's a cool way to make that process measurable and show how long things were taking and then make it visible to employees. I've done some Kanban work with marketing teams, which is really cool because I think marketing teams tend to, some have a hard time with Scrum because they don't know what they're going to be working on in a week. And so this helps them deal with a lot of churn. Right now, I would say the biggest area where I've been seeing a lot of action for Kanban is security teams. Same reason. I mean, it's high turnaround. Every day is different than the day before, and they need to be able to move quickly. I think the other piece of that is burnout is super high for them. And, because it's always high stress, high pace, everything's urgent, figuring out a way to kind of meter that and create a sustainable pace and a realistic pace to help protect your employees becomes really important. So I think Kanban can be really helpful for teams like that.
Yeah, and once you learn more about Kanban, you're going to want to Kanban every airport restaurant queue.
Yes. You'll see it everywhere, right? You're like, ugh.
I think that closes us out for the questions that I've seen in the queue, but if I missed anybody, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask away.
Okay. Yeah, and feel free to email me too. My Twitter handle is here in the corner, and this is my email address. I love to talk about this stuff. If there's anything you think about later, or if you watch the recording and want to ask a question, this is definitely my passion. And I love seeing part of this story, right, of working through some of the resistance and reluctance to go through some of this and what can feel like a heavy process or a lot of bureaucracy. I love seeing teams and portfolios and organizations come out the other side of that and really like singing its praises. And it takes on a life of its own outside of having somebody kind of guide them through it. And that's really feels like the best success as a coach.